Hi, this video is about learning probability. We'd like to talk about three different things in relation to students learning probability. First, the development of probabilistic thinking. Next, the challenging idea for students, the law of large numbers. And finally, using a simulation approach to help students learn about probability. Students tend to learn about probability along a trajectory, and at the beginning of their ideas, their early conceptions of likelihood are surprisingly problematic. If you ask young students, preschool or kindergarten students, questions about the likelihood of things happening, you'll get some pretty surprising answers, a lot of conflicting ideas, and not a clear sense about how to judge those things at all. As students begin to develop ideas, the first thing they tend to think about and being able to understand is whether uh, events are possible or not possible. And that's a good place to start with students, to talk about different events and say, is it possible for this to happen, or is it impossible? Is it not possible? We can refine that idea and start pushing into the differences between possible events by looking at more likely and less likely events and comparing different events and asking which is more likely to happen. They can refine that idea by looking at the continuum of likelihood, and I've got a diagram of it down here. And on the continuum of likelihood, at one end we have impossible events that could never happen, all the way up to, at the other end, certain events that will happen, and we can have any kind of probability along here. So it's a great way to visualize more likely and less likely by asking students to place events at different places along the continuum from impossible to certain. Of course, in the middle, things are equally likely to happen or not happen. So it's a good way for kids to start more formally comparing the likelihood of events. And then finally, the last place we go is to represent probability with fractions or decimals or percents, to think about the numerical values that help us understand the probability of an event happening. A couple things to note. Too often we start at the end of the trajectory. We start at representing probability with fractions, decimals, and percents in school, and kids don't have some of this underpinning, some of these conceptual ideas, and they probably don't have a sense of there's a continuum from impossible to certain to think about. So we need to start at the beginning with kids and begin discussions broadly. Is this possible or not possible? Is it likely or not less likely? And develop this idea of a continuum of likelihood before we add the fractions or decimals or percents. We can help students move along the continuum, develop these ideas along the trajectory by pushing them to think at the next stage, make predictions, and test them. So let's say your students have a good sense of whether events are possible or not possible. You would want to start asking questions about are events more likely or less likely. Ask them to make predictions about the likelihood of things happening, and then check them out and see whether they happen or not. And pushing them to move into the next level is a good way to help them move along in their development. We can use different tools to explore likelihoods. We can use number cubes or dice, coins, spinners. Spinners have some very nice things about them. They're powerful because they're flexible, they're visual, intuitive, and they can be fun. For example, if you take a look at this spinner down here, it's a very flexible thing. I could have colored any amount of blue and yellow and asked this question, what's the likelihood of spinning yellow? It's a very visual thing. We can look at it and get a sense of it, and students intuitively tend to understand spinners and say, what's the likelihood of spinning yellow? Well, that's closer down towards the impossible range than it is towards the certain range, because when I spin it, there's a smaller space for yellow. And they can have fun actually spinning things around and testing out probabilities. Final comment, we can incorporate this type of thinking throughout the entire school day, from circle time at the beginning of the day all the way through all your different subjects, asking questions about what's likely or not likely to happen, what's possible or not possible, having a continuum of likelihood and throwing things up on there. That can be a nice way to integrate it throughout the day. In our next video, we'll get into the law of large numbers and how that can be a challenging idea for students, and wrap up with talking about using a simulation approach.